Good evening, everyone. I appreciate your patience here. Doing these virtual events is more complicated than they look. I want to welcome everyone to our free market speaker series. I'm Professor Peter Calcano, the director of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process in the School of Business at the College of Charleston. The mission of the Center for Public Choice and Market Process to advance the economic, political, and moral foundations of a free society. And we wish we could all be together in person today. I think it would have been easier. But this virtual environment provides us with an opportunity to reach out to more individuals beyond our campus, which I'm very excited about. We've collaborated with other centers at colleges and universities for today's event. And I want to thank the following centers and organizations for joining us today. AIER's Charleston chapter of the Basquiat Society, the Center for Free Enterprise at the University of Louisville, Political Economy Research Institute at Middle Tennessee State University, and the Center for Economic and Education and Financial Literacy at the University of West Georgia. A few reminders. All participants should remain muted with cameras off to minimize distractions. And please be sure to use the speaker view as opposed to the gallery view, as the only camera that will remain live will be our speakers. The chat option will be open, and we ask that you put all questions be submitted via chat to be answered at the end of the talk. We have moderators monitoring the chat and participant list to read your questions. At the end of this, we'll be sending out a survey following the event to help provide us feedback, and we ask that you take the time to please fill it out. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Dr. Deidre Mccloskey. Dr. Mccloskey is the Distinguished Professor of Economics and of History and Professor of English and of Communication Emerita at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Mccloskey received her PhD in economics from Harvard University. She has previously taught at the University of Iowa and the University of Chicago. She is the author of 25 books and has published over 350 articles in academic journals. She is one of the foremost economic historians in the field of economics, with recent acclaim for her trilogy on the bourgeoisie virtues, dignity, and equality. She suggests that to get better at economic science, we need, quote unquote, humanomics, economics with the humans left in it. Today, she's going to talk with us about bettering humanomics, a new and old approach to economic science. And with this, I will hopefully turn it over to Dr. Mccloskey.
He can't hear me, I don't think.
There we go. You are all set, Deidre.
How long should I speak now?
Still go for about 40 minutes.
How much?
About 40.
Okay, sure. Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, here I am, dears. Glad you've all gathered from near and far. Suppose I put this on speaker view so that I'm looking at myself instead of the wonderful collection of books you have in your office, Peter. Let me see. Edit full. Whoa, wait a second. I'm completely incompetent at this. Now I've turned it over. Now it's got only you. Now, have I done this wrong? Am I on? Oh, Jesus.
You're good to go, Deirdre.
Okay, you can hear me. All right, I have in press actually a book which is coming out from the University of Chicago Press in the spring of next year, which is the title of this afternoon's talk. By the way, I should say I have a speech defect. I stutter. My problem is I stutter on the word stutter frequently. So I often say I have a speech defect instead. Okay. You can either grow accustomed to it or run screaming from the room. It's okay. I don't mind. So this book is an attempt to lead economics away from a mechanical approach towards a more human approach, an approach that would be recognized in the Department of English or history or philosophy or theology as speaking to their concerns, and not only to the concerns of a, so to speak, engineering economics, a policy economics, which dominates the field now. Now, anyone here who's gotten into modern economics, whether as an undergraduate or afterwards, knows that modern economics in the last half century or so, is very focused on using economic arguments and economic findings, economic science, to improve the world. Now one can hardly object to the impulse when you see that someone's poor, you want to help them. When you see that some industry is not working as well as it could, you want to improve it. So it's very natural and even commendable to some degree that economists have wanted to be social engineers. You know, it's sort of like the old joke, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. The three most unbelievable sentences in English. The check is in the mail. Of course, I'll respect you in the morning. And I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. And the economists, especially in the English speak, well, in all languages, but economics these days is mainly an English speaking subject. So it's mainly American and to some degree English economists who have pushed this idea. Also, by the way, in an earlier generation, economists from Holland, they have pushed this idea of economics as an engineering subject that's going to improve the world. What's wrong with that? Well, there are a bunch of things wrong with it. For one thing, we don't know the world well enough to successfully manipulate it. And you can see that would be a problem. If you had a car, you were driving a car, and when you turned the wheel to the right, sometimes it went to the right, sometimes it went to the left, and you didn't know which way it was going to go. My advice would be to stop the damn car. Go to the side of the road as quickly as you can and get out of the thing. Stop trying to engineer the automobile down the road if it was unreliable in that way, or if you didn't know, if you were ignorant of the difference between the brake and the accelerator. Suppose you were a very slow learner and you kept pushing the brake when you meant the accelerator and vice versa, or you didn't know how to shift the gears. You know, ignorance is a big problem. It's a problem actually in engineering itself. I'm a great admirer of engineers. I've had all my life, I've had dear friends who were engineers, and I learned a lot from them and from their attitudes. But they're always very careful about the errors in engineering. There's a sort of an engineering joke. I sort of like to teach with jokes. Here's one. When the engineers graduate from their engineering school, the dean gives them an envelope, sealed envelope, and he says to each of the candidates who's going to get their BS in engineering, open this before you submit the final report on your first big engineering project. So this one guy gets his envelope, and he's going to follow what the dean says. He's working on a bridge, and he calculates, the forces on the bridge, and so he makes this nice bridge. And he's about to submit this to his clients, when suddenly he says, "No, wait a second, I got to open that envelope." And he opens the envelope, and it says on the piece of paper, it says, "Multiply everything by 3," which is to say, when you think you've got the engineering knowledge to manipulate the economy, be careful, because you might not know very well, and it would be prudent to, as it were, multiply everything by 3. So there's the ignorance problem, you could call it. And there's another problem, which you could call the ethical problem, the moral problem. Is it really me, the expert economist, who should be running your life? I have friends who, in economics, Bob Frank at Cornell, for example, who are exponents of nudging. They instead of allowing people to not save for their old age, we kind of bias the form that we send to them so that they're likely to do the right thing and save for their old age. And, you need to nudge them a bit. Push them here, push them there, a little bit, just a little bit. Bob was defending this view to me one day, and he said, "Dear, look, this is paternalistic libertarianism." And I said to him, "Bob, that's a contradiction in terms. Either you believe that people are free adults and should be given the dignity of making their own decisions, ignorant they may be. Look, I'm ignorant, you're ignorant, we're all ignorant. We're going to make mistakes. Either you give them the dignity of that, or you don't. You take over their life as an economic engineer." So those are a couple of big problems with the way economics is done now. There are other problems, and sort of oddly, I've got another book which will come out from the University of Chicago Press in autumn of next year, not this year, but autumn of next year. In the spring, this book I'm talking about now, but then in the autumn, another book. And that book is a more sustained criticism of the way economics is now done. I figured it was good to have the kind of positive message out first in the spring, and then in the fall I hit them with the negative argument. But I've just given you the elevator speech for the second volume, for the critical volume. So why should, now here, let me express the theme here. The theme is that the humanities, what you studied in your English courses or philosophy or theology, history, your experience as a human, your experience in your love affairs or in your family, those need to be in economics in a serious way. Whereas the standard model of economics, which I learned when I was a kid, and I've practiced and written books about and in favor of, is that all you need to know to do an economic analysis is that people are maximizers, that they do as well as they can. And that's okay. That's true in a lot of situations. If you're talking about the foreign exchange market, it's probably not going to be very interesting to ask whether these people in the foreign exchange market love each other. That's not going to matter because they're just arbitraging. They're just seeing deals they can make and making as much money as they can. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But is it an adequate way of approaching the economy? And are you going to, here's the crucial point. Are you going to miss important understandings of how the economy works if you stick to this one hypothesis that people, well, we express it in economics, people maximize utility. This was brought to the fore by a famous economist named Paul Anthony Samuelson at MIT. He was, in case you need this information, he was my mother's mixed doubles tennis partner for many years. I didn't actually ever know Samuelson, but my parents did. Anyway, he was the great genius of economics in the 1940s and 50s and 1960s. And he said, look, the core of economics is about this maximizing. All this other stuff is not as important. And a lot of economists came to agree with this. My colleague at the University of Chicago, Gary Becker, was an outstanding example of this. He was a great economist and a great thinker about economics, but it was all about this Max. I call him Max, as though his first name was Max. Max U, maximize utility. In German, it would be Max U. And he's this maximizing machine. And it's a little bit narrow. It's not something that makes a lot of sense in terms of philosophy, ethics, theology, sociology for that matter, your experience of life. Now, there are people like this. I won't get into the politics of it, but there is a certain very well-known person in the United States who holds a very, very important office, who is a Max U character. All he cares about is himself. All he cares about is maximizing his welfare, by which he mainly means his wealth. And as I say, in some applications, that kind of assumption is fine, but is it really adequate? Now, here's one way of seeing how slightly crazy this Max U, if it's exclusively Max U, economics is. Now, understand, I know Max U economics very well. I learned it when I was young. I've written, as I said, I've written books on it. I did a book, an intermediate microeconomics book called The Applied Theory of Price. Last edition was a long time ago, but it's filled with applications of Max U. And I think it's a great tool for many, many, many economic problems. So I'm not saying throw away all that stuff. In fact, I'm not saying throw away anything. I'm not saying throw away econometrics or throw away selfishness as a motivation of people or any of that. I'm saying we've got to supplement economics. Now here's an example. Here's a how can I say it? Here's a hint or a piece of evidence, put it that way, that suggests that we've got to do something more than just max U, maximize utility. Ask yourself, how important is talk in the economy? Why do people talk so much in business? Why do they have meetings all the time? Nowadays, they're having them by Zoom, but you know, they'd fly across the world and have a meeting and they talk. Now, one way this has been dealt with in economics is so-called transaction costs. My former colleague at the University of Chicago, Ronald Coase, was a great exponent of this. Because when he was young, he was English. He went to the United States for a year as a young graduate student in economics. And he spent the year following people in business around, mainly men, in fact, entirely men, I'd have to say. It was in the 1930s, early 30s, and watching what they did. And Ronald noted that they spent all their day talking to each other. Now, wait a second. Max U doesn't need to talk. Or to put it more exactly, he doesn't need to discuss. There's nothing to discuss. He makes an offer, it gets refused or not. Then he walks away. This, you understand, this Max U character is economics, or the economy, the society, as a bunch of vending machines. When you go to a vending machine, you put your quarter in or your 50 cents, or more like $1 these days, you get out a can of Coke. And there's no discussion involved. You, in the old expression, you pays your money and you take your choice. So that's it. But actually, in the economy, there's a vast amount of talk. And as consumers, you talk a lot. Sometimes you're talking to yourself. There's kind of an internal dialogue. Should I buy this car or that car? Should I buy this coat or that coat? So there's sort of internal talk, internal discussion. But there's even a good deal of explicit outward discussion about what to buy, where to go, what to do. And you could say, well, you know, so what? Some people have red hair, some people don't. That doesn't matter for the economy. But I think it matters a great deal. And here's how I know. Here's one piece of evidence. If you calculate, look, here's how you do it. I've actually performed this calculation. You go to the Department of Labor of the United States government, and you get an enormously long list of 500 occupations, very detailed. Secretary in a blast furnace firm, or lawyer dealing in patent law, or chemist in a drug company. Anyway, all these, or a policeman, or a manager of these people, or whatever, all these detailed occupations. And then ask yourself, and there are ways of actually making this more objective, if you want to talk that way, but ask yourself how much persuasion is involved. I've actually asked people in the police force what percentage of their job is what I call sweet talk, persuading people, as opposed to exercising force. And they always say about half is persuasion, sweet talk, which is somewhat surprising because we think of the police as, you know, exercising violence all the time, but they don't mainly. They're walking around, talking to people in the neighborhood, trying to persuade them. But there are other occupations, like the one I'm in, being a college professor, or being a teacher of any sort, being a first grade teacher for that matter, where certainly the main job is to persuade the students to learn. Now there's information transmittal, and that's what I'm talking about. I don't mean just transferring. That you could do by a vending machine or a book. Just hand people an economics book and say, go study that. I'm not going to talk to you anymore. But in fact, your teachers that you had or are having now, a big part of what they do is to persuade you to be excited by, say, economics, or to believe this or that way of looking at economics, or some sort of attitudes that they're trying to convey. And for a very large group of occupations, managerial occupations, the job is mainly sweet talk, is mainly persuasion. In a free society, the people aren't slaves. You can't just take out a whip and you're the manager of a local McDonald's or something. You can't take out a whip and start beating the people if they don't do the hamburger job the way you want. You have to teach them. You have to persuade them. You have to do sweet talk. And I say again, it's not just information. That's a separate matter. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the sweet talk part. And it's very big. I made a calculation a long time ago, which has been done again by me and other people. It comes out to about the same figure, sometimes a little larger. 1/4 of the labor income in the United States pays for sweet talk, persuasion. I mean, there are extreme cases like lawyers, job, and 90% to persuade people. There are sweet talk whose whole job is to, hear arguments, persuasive arguments, and to make a judgment about them. So it's 1/4. It's really big. Now, if it was just about red hair and blonde hair, or black hair, that wouldn't have a big economic effect. It might be important in the hairdressing industry, but it's not important for the economy as a whole. Then you could set it aside, but it's 1/4 of labor income. So that's a kind of an indicator that there's something important going on here. Something that involves our human ability to talk to each other, our human ability to change minds, as we say. It's, when you think about it, it's kind of a strange expression. I want to change your mind. It's like reaching inside your head, turning things on and off. But that's what we're doing very largely in our social life, our economic life, is talk, changing people's minds. So what? So you've shown, okay, maybe I've shown that talk is important. And one more point about talk until I move to an application. And that is that persuasive talk is profoundly unpredictable. To put it another way, talk is creative. Any teacher at almost any level of teaching can tell you this, that in lots of fields, certainly in economics and philosophy and history, as you teach, you learn things. And if you converse with the students and they're engaged enough to start having a real conversation, you learn from the students. And this happens to me all the time when I teach. Either I, in my own little internal dialogue, say, hey, there's another way of not just saying it, but there's another idea. but I also from the people who talk, and I'm sure it's going to happen this afternoon, I learn things and I think, oh yeah, that's interesting. And that, when you think about it, a real conversation, it's not just an exchange of information. I have to say, I have noticed that men tend to have conversations that involve sending information across to each other. You can see this in sports talk a lot. Oh, you know, the guy who had the highest batting average in the National League is blah blah. Whereas among women, there's much more talk about other than just transmittal of information. But even the transmittal of information among men, when they're being sports talkers, is often in aid of some other purpose, either to establish their dominance. I know more about baseball than you do, although if they're friends, they don't want to do that too much, or to talk more generally about the game of baseball, about the baseball world, and one discovers things in the course of such a conversation. And in a real intellectual, or indeed a personal conversation with your husband or with your boyfriend, if it's a real conversation, it's creative. I always think of it this way, that there's in the middle of the room, there's this thing, and if you're having a real good conversation, you're all working on it. And I would argue that that's where industrial creativity comes from. That the amazing explosion of economic creativity since around 1800, first in Europe and now lots of other places, China and India and so on, comes from this conversation. It doesn't come from mechanical maximization as much as the creative conversation of humankind. And that's my big application of this idea. I think there are probably many, many other applications. For example, I think that in labor economics, a field kind of on the edge of my interest, but interesting, I'm sure, to many of you, what a job means is as important as the pay. And you can calculate how important it is. If a job adds to your dignity, you can pay someone less. So priests are not paid very much, for example. So there's a meaning side that the humanities deal with. The philosophy department, the English department, theology, history, etc. There's a meaning side of economic interactions, or social more generally, that you would think would have a big effect, or could have a big effect in the study of the labor market. And I can see lots of other cases of this. I've had some interest in so-called feminist economics. And economics that asks, is gender important in the economy? Or are these Max Hugh characters without gender? Does it matter that there are men and women for the economic behavior? And we, in feminist economics, I've only done a little bit of scientific work in it, but I've always approved of it and tried to encourage people in it. That too takes a view of humans that goes beyond Max Hugh. That doesn't mean that there's not Max U involved in, say, a marriage. There is. There is self-interest involved. But anyone who thinks that self-interest is all that's going on in a marriage has got a screw loose. In fact, there's a famous paper by this man I mentioned, this wonderful economist, Gary Becker, a long time ago. He said, you know, marriage is like an exchange. And in this article he did, it's a very famous article in economics, F and M, he didn't say feminine, masculine, or female and male. He said F and M meet in the forest, and they decide that they'll do better if they connect with each other, and one does the auto repair and the other does the cooking, because they can specialize, and then their household production possibility curve will be further out. And that's true enough. But in this article, and it's very funny to read now, though most economists don't see how funny it is. Gary, every time he says, well, you know, some people think that marriage has to do with love, but he always puts love in scare quotes, love, as though it were kind of silly and feminine to consider that love might be what's going on here. It's not all that's going on, but if you don't think of marriage as having something to do with love, even arranged marriages for that matter, you're not getting the point. Well, I keep saying the point, but I don't mean see, it's both. It's both self-interest and Max U and F and M making a trade. I get it. But it's also love, isn't it? And if you're going to do the economics of marriage, you better know about love too. So anyway, there are lots of opportunities to do what I call humanomics. Humanomics. It was coined by an economist named Bart Wilson at Chapman University in California. He's a brilliant economist. And he's an exponent of this humanomics. And I am too. And as I've looked back, I've realized that there have been lots of other economists. A dear friend of mine in Holland named Arjo Klammer is one of them, but a great economist named Albert Hirschman was another, and all the way back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith was an exponent of humanomics. And the evidence for that, I think, is just overwhelming. So anyway, what's new and old in terms of my title is this humanomics. It's a new way of doing it because so many economists are off with this Max U stuff and they can't escape it. And they think that marriage is only about trade, but it's also very old because way back to the beginning of economics, and I have to say that economics really began with Adam Smith, it's been accepted, or not, that's not quite the word, it's been urged that moral sentiments, as Smith's Scottish colleagues and he himself spoke of it, moral sentiments work in the economy. So, what's my big application of this? I have an old friend, he's not a close friend, but he's a friendly acquaintance named Herbert Gintis, who's a very good economist. He was once a Marxist, as I was to some degree, and then gradually became less and less of a Marxist. And he's a very creative economic thinker. And I given a long time ago at a meeting of the American Economics Association, I gave a talk somewhat like the one I'm giving now, but even more primitive than this. And Herb stood up and said, "Oh, Deirdre, I think what you're saying is very interesting, but you've got to have a killer app that is an application of this argument that's really powerful in terms of thinking about the economy. And I said, well, yeah, I agree. And then over the next, 15 years, I developed the killer app. And here it is. The big question in economics, the big question, to put the emphasis right, is what Adam Smith called the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. How is it that an economy does well or poorly, especially for the very poor? And after all, in the old days, an economy could do very well for the king because he was extracting stuff from everyone else. But everyone else, most of our ancestors, I guess 99% of our ancestors, were the unspeakably poor, partly because the king was seizing stuff from them. Why is it that now we're so rich? You say, well, we're not rich. I mean, boy, you hear the politicians complaining about how poor we are all the time, but it's stupid. It's not correct. Let's talk about Americans, but you can talk this way even about modern Chinese, for example, compared with the Chinese 30 or 40 years ago. We're very rich in material goods and not so bad off in what you might call spiritual goods. How rich are we? Well, here's how rich we are. In 1800, the average per capita income in the world, right? Take all the income and put it in modern prices, 2020 prices, and that the world has, and then divide that by the number of people in the world, was about $2 or $3 a day. Think of trying to get along on wherever you are on $2 or $3 a day. Now, this isn't about inflation or money or something like this. I'm talking in modern prices. For $2, you can, well, you can buy a couple of cans of Coca-Cola, maybe, and nothing else. You won't have any food, you won't have any clothing or shelter or education or foreign travel or books or anything else. $2 or $3 a day. That's how poor your ancestors and mine were. What's the average in the United States nowadays? For every man, woman, and child in the United States, on average, and of course there's a lot of variation, it's $130 a day in the same prices. Now this is not, an easy or calculation to make, but almost all economists and economic historians would agree with it. This isn't something that I've just made up. This is what my colleagues in economic history have done, and I've made small contributions to it, but it's mainly their work. And it's gone from $2 a day average in the world to, in places like the United States or Finland or Japan, which have taken full advantage of improvements, to $130 or $100 a day. And even in the world as a whole, it's increased to $33 a day, from 2 to 33. To form an idea of what the average income is in the world, think of Brazil. Turns out that Brazilian average national income is about the world's average income. But Brazil in 1800 was $1 or $2 a day. Now it's $33 a day. So it's an enormous increase, even including poor countries nowadays, but especially in these countries that have broken out and have taken full advantage of what's available. Now, what happened? How did this happen? Well, I'm going to be crazily brief here, but two common arguments are wrong. One is the argument that it's accumulation, that it's capital accumulation, piling up bricks and so on, and bachelor's degrees. And the other is that it's exploitation. The 1619, what would you call it, movement says that American national income was caused by the exploitation of slaves. Neither of these is true. Neither the argument on the right that it's accumulation or the argument on the left that it's exploitation. No. It was ethical change that caused the modern world. What? This is real humanomics. This is the humanities in aid of economic understanding. It was ethical change, which I've documented in my trilogy at some length. There's a book coming out in about a month from another book, but from the University of Chicago Press again, with Art Carden. He and I wrote this book called Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich. How the bourgeois deal enriched the world. And that's what happened. Liberalism, understood as a society of non-slaves, society where wives are not subordinated to husbands and subjects are not subordinated to kings, a free society where there are no slaves, whether chattel slaves or anyway people subordinated by violence to other people, where that's not there, or at least you try to make it not there. That is what inspired people to innovation. Mechanical, biological, institutional innovations. Let me just give one example. I could go on, we could close the doors and we could go on I could go on for 10 hours on this, but I'm not gonna, I'm almost through. Take containerization. Those big boxes that you see on railways that are put on ships, and then they come and then they are added to 18 wheelers and off they go to the store. Containerization was invented in 1956 by a man, by a man who owned a trucking firm in North Carolina. And he just had the idea. Suppose we have standardized boxes, 20 feet and 40 feet. And we make them of corrugated iron, steel actually, on the side so that they don't collapse when you pile them on top of each other. So it makes them strong. And then we put stuff in it and send it to China. And the Chinese put stuff in it and send it back. And that was an enormously important change in cutting the cost of transportation of goods. Yet it's just an idea. But these ideas didn't happen until there was an ethical change of the sort that valued new ideas, that gave permission, this is the key word here, permission to ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And that's the key to the modern world. It's an ethical change. We stopped thinking of people, look at Shakespeare's world, for example. None of Shakespeare's plays have real heroes who are in business. They're either fools or they're evil if they're in business. The only dignified people are soldiers, actually only soldiers in Shakespeare, namely aristocrats, the leaders of the soldiers. And that changed. By the time of Jane Austen, one of my favorite authors, it's no longer true. And business people are being accorded respect. And that's enough to make this enormous increase, this factor of what, 33,000% from 1800 to the present, this eradication of much of the poverty that our ancestors were object to. So we have yeah. So that's my killer app. I haven't heard from Herb. I hope someday he'll say, oh, geez, you're absolutely right, Deirdre. This is a killer app. I've been summarizing it very briefly, but that's the point. The humanities, what we study in the English department, novels and poetry, what we study in theology or in history, those things are crucial for explaining modern enrichment. And economists can't keep going on and on about Max Hu. They can't keep going on and on about accumulation or exploitation, neither of which explains what they intend to explain, which is how we got so rich and how we can go on being rich. So the argument is a very simple one, and here I'll end. My claim, my substantive claim about the economic history is that the way we got rich is through liberating people. First poor men, then actual slaves, then women, then immigrants, then this, then that. We kept slow, it's not perfect. It's still, Black lives do matter. It's not finished, but we have vastly improved on this front. And this gives people not just the smart ideas about like containerization, but it also gives them the freedom to move, for example, to open a hairdressing salon in a place that didn't have it before. So this enterprise that all humans have and have had since the beginning is liberated after 1800. First in Britain and what became the United States, or was the United States by then, and then in France and in Germany and in Italy and then in China and then in Botswana and then all over the place. So if such an ethical change can have such an enormous effect, and in this case, a good effect, then we need to include how ethics changes in thinking about the economy. And that's a job for what? The Department of Theology, or the Department of Psychology for that matter. So that's my tale. And that's what you've gotten is a kind of the CEO's view of the book, an executive summary, so to speak, of this book. And I think it's important. I think I've solved, to be very vain about it, I'm not vain exactly, I think I'm being accurate. I think I've solved the central problem of economics, which is why are we so rich and how to stay rich. You stay rich by freeing people, not by nudging them. Okay, I'm all through. As I said, I could go on and on. So suppose we chat a bit.
We have some questions, Deidre, and we've got one of our students are going to read some of the questions here in the chat to you so that you can answer them.
I'm the answer.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for that great talk and for coming to speak to us today. And thank you to those who wrote in to the chat with some questions.
Yes.
Our first question comes from Emily Davis, who says, federal government agencies and politicians are expected to make policy and legislative decisions that are non-biased and based on data and hard facts. Considerations of what make people unique seem to be excluded from decision-making. They are expected to make policies that benefit people in common. Emily poses the question, as the federal government becomes more responsible for economic policy, will it be more difficult to supplement economics with these human considerations?
Well, I'm not sure it'll be more difficult. What I object to, of course, is the premise that the government should or needs to take over more and more of the management of the economy. I was speaking to a cousin of mine a couple of years ago. She works for the CIA. As a matter of fact, she manages spies, in case you want to know. And I said to her, you know, gee, I don't think the government should be so big. And she said, but in a modern economy, you need more management of the economy. You need more complicated. As the economy gets more complicated, the government should have a larger and larger role. And I said to her, no, dear, it's the other way around. The more complicated the economy gets, the less the government can competently do. It's this point. Think of the car analogy that I gave, driving the car. Suppose the car is extremely complicated and gets to have all sorts of features that you don't understand. Then, if it was a Model T, you could drive it. But if it's this very complicated thing that looks like an airplane, a place that there's so many dials and so on, then you can't. So it's the other way around. We need less government for a modern economy, not more. And what we need is humane people. You know, so think of it this way. My way of looking at it is that what we need is an economy that assumes people are adults. Not an economy where everyone's going around assuming that everyone else is a stupid child who needs to be managed. I'm all through on that point. I can't hear you, dear.
Sorry, I was muted for a second there. Okay,
Yes.
Our next question comes from Eric Alston, who wrote in and said, the emphasis on the importance of talk poses an interesting puzzle with respect to an institutional feature of prosperous market societies. Mm-hmm. The ability of institutions to credibly apply impersonally is viewed as a crucial characteristic for the ability of social orders to scale and function at the magnitude and complexity they do today. Yet it would seem that certain crucial decisions, including surrounding the definition of our institutions themselves, of necessity involve personal interaction. So Eric asks, how do you reconcile the tension between the two? In what ways are economic interactions and institutions personal? In what ways are they impersonal? And how and where do these spheres intersect and influence one another?
Well, that's very much to the point. Impersonal. Look, the paper for this book was made way off over some other country, and the author came from Russia, and blah, blah, blah. So there's this enormous modern trade. There is a famous short essay called I, Pencil, which, by the way, has a nice modern video that you can look at, I, comma, pencil. And you hold up a pencil and you, Milton Friedman, my colleague, used to do this. And you'd say, well, the wood comes from here. So there are all these anonymous arm's length transactions that have to happen in the modern economy. But where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, as we say in country music, is this personal connection. Because, let's see how to think about it. There's, so to speak, the impersonal relies on the personal, express it that way. Or is dependent on, the Latin means hangs from the person. This is the personal, this is the impersonal. And you can't, here, express it this way, to go back to my point about Max U. If all we were Donald Trump's, I wasn't going to say that. If all we were Max U individuals, nothing would work. The way Donald Trump ran his enterprises was to cheat all the time. He wouldn't pay people. I have friends here in Chicago who are architects, and they tell me no one in Chicago will do business, no bank and no architect will do business with Donald Trump because he doesn't ever pay his debts. If you ask for payment, you're a plumber or something who worked on his building, say, please pay me what you promised to pay, he sues you. And if everyone worked that way, it's obvious that the arm's length stuff wouldn't work. But it's a very interesting sociological question. How this, I think it's a very insightful question to ask. What exactly the connection is between the Max U anonymous stuff and the personal. But that will require you to think seriously about the personal and not just Max U. I mean, look, there has to be, I've actually made this point about what's known as constitutional political economy, the great contribution of the great economist James Buchanan. And I actually said this to Jim in a talk where he was in the audience, said, look, for your constitution to get constituted, people have to care about ethics. If they don't, they won't even show up at the meeting. Why would they bother? So there's a deep sense in which you have to have an ethical grounding learned at your mother's knee for an economy to work. And indeed, it's been shown. I mean, this is not just me saying this. Lots of people have shown that in societies in which people don't trust each other, haven't learned that at their mother's knee, where it's all Max U. There's a famous book about villages in southern Italy by a man named Banfield a long time ago. He's made this point. The society can't work because everyone, it's not that they hate each other, they're just suspicious of everyone. I'm all through if you want to ask another question. I'm the answer lady. Ask me about anything, about your love life, anything you want.
Our next question comes from Michelle, and she says, it seems that cancel culture has limited our ability to use sweet talk to persuade.
Yeah,
what does that mean for prosperity, and what can we do about that?
Well, that's an interesting question. There was is a letter or a statement that was published in Harper's Magazine, online first, and now I think it's in the actual magazine, or going to be, where about 150 people, miscellaneous group of people, were asked to sign this letter. And it was against cancel culture. or similar impulses from the right of politics. And I was asked to sign this, and I did. And a lot of the people who signed with it, I don't agree with at all on other things. I mentioned that Paul Samuelson was the great MIT leader in economics, but the great MIT leader in linguistics is Noam Chomsky, who's still alive. I debated him last year. And I don't agree with anything about his politics. In my view, he's wrong. I'm just not going any further. But he signed it too. And then it caused a lot of kerfuffle. People got all agitated about it because they wanted to go on canceling people. And I think that's got to stop. I don't think it's the end of Western civilization, as some people believe. I think there are cycles in this, and it'll come and go. But it's not good. You got to listen to people. There's a great statement, which is kind of the motto of my intellectual life, where I try to make it, by a philosopher named Emily Rorty, the first wife of an even more well-known philosopher named Rorty. And Emily in 1983 said, look, our first responsibility is to listen. I could summarize what she says just by saying that. Our responsibility as scholars or as citizens or as marital partners is to listen. And then to change our minds, not because, as she said, the phases of the moon. So even crazy people change their ideas if they're QAnon believers or something. They go off, the moon changes and they change their mind. But no, they change their mind because they've listened to their husband or and he's listened to her or their colleagues. And this stuff of, no, we can't listen to you. We can't hear your opinion on campus because you're right wing or something is very foolish.
Deidre, we're going to, let me see here if I can do what I need to do here. But I want to thank you for
Certainly
being here today. I want to thank you for the talk and spending the time with us. I know that I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I want to thank everybody for coming out today. I remind you all that we're going to send out a survey and we want your feedback. We're going to be doing other events and participating with other colleges and university centers all throughout this semester. So we look forward to you hopefully attending our other events. But I really want to have everybody please thank Dr. Mccloskey for attending today and for participating in this event and giving us this phenomenal talk.
Well,
thank you for coming, and I hope that we'll get a chance to interact in a way beyond this in the near future. But thank you, Deidre.
Okay, dearie. Yay.
That is the problem, right? We don't have that round of applause at the very end.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'll sort of, I follow the Chicago Cubs, and now they're playing baseball, of course, and they have recorded crowd noise.
Yes.
In all the stadiums to make the players feel like that there's fans there.
I had that thought at one point in time about sports in particular. I noticed that, and I thought, so that gives me a great idea. So next time I'll see if we can get some cameras.
That would be fun. That'd be fun. You could just record it off the TV for a baseball game and have it come on at the end. Okay, dear.
right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
It's
you
been
again.
fun.